the Ryan and Twombly documentary project and oral history. This is Jim Ryan asking questions of Alice Ryan and Bill Ryan in my home in Auburn, Alabama, at 667 Burke Place on a very cold winter day, an exceptionally cold winter day for us at about 15 degrees this morning. And Bill and Alice Ryan are here visiting on the occasion of my birthday, and because it was time for a visit. And I'll be asking a few questions off screen of Alice and Bill, and we'll probably be asking questions mainly about their early days and respective childhoods and extended families in a very informal way. And so I wanted to ask Alice to begin by reflecting on as far back as she could with her, with reference to her family, grandparents, great-grandparents even, if you're able to remember much of that, and tell us something about the kind of family background that you remember best and earliest from your childhood.
Well, I'll do my best. I only heard snatches of stories about my grandparents, only one of whom I ever met. My father's parents were Samuel Long and Mary Follis. Mary was one of three siblings. Kate and Ed never married, but and my dad lived with them. I'll explain in a little bit. Samuel Long was a New York City cop, and I have a picture of him with his fellow colleagues in the police force with the big, tall, stiff helmets that they wore. Things are pretty vague about Samuel. There was a tragic accident in the family. There was my dad and three brothers, and one of the boys got hold of their dad's service pistol, revolver, whatever they call it, and was shot or shot himself. He was probably 8 or 9 years old and died instantly. Sometime after that, Samuel left, and that's all I know. Mary raised the boys until she died, which was apparently quite young, and my dad and his brothers went to live with the maiden aunt and bachelor uncle, Kate Follis and Ed Follis.
How many, if I could ask more about your dad's family, how many brothers and sisters did your dad have?
He had 3 brothers and no sisters, and he was the oldest, I believe. Paul was the one who was shot. I think that was his name. Then there was Joseph Long, who I remember very well as, I'm sure he had a job, but he sold tickets at Ebbets Field for the Dodgers, and that to me was very exciting. And then the youngest brother was Richard, and Richard lived in Pittsburgh.
That's Uncle Rich, the
Uncle
one I would
Rich.
remember, of course.
Uncle Rich.
I remember Uncle Rich myself.
He ended up living in Pittsburgh and was sort of our family when Dad and I went to Pittsburgh to live when we were first married. So my dad, to back up again, was living with Kate and Ed, the spinster and the bachelor, and in fact there was another sister, Agnes. Agnes and Kate made their living as seamstresses and would go to people's homes and sew their spring wardrobe and their fall wardrobe, etc. My dad never graduated from high school, but he lied a little bit about his age and joined the Navy. And that was in World War I.
If I could provide a little cross-reference here, in a previous oral history project tape that Renee and I made interviewing Larry Twombly and Margaret Twombly, a similar story about cheating on the age requirement for enlisting in the services. It seems to be a recurring theme among our extended families.
It was probably very common. And I think it was fairly common that a fellow didn't finish high school. If he had that urge to go in the Army or the Navy, that's what he did. And of course, my dad's parents weren't living. The aunts and uncle did the best they could. So he went and joined the Navy. And my mother's family, she came from a big Irish family. Both my grandmother and grandfather had come to this country from Ireland, and as far as I know, married here. I'm not positive about that. He worked for the post office. He was a postman.
Do you remember some of their names?
Daniel was my grandfather, Daniel McNamara, and Nellie McNamara was my grandmother. And I think, I'm trying to remember what her name was before she got married. Maybe that'll come to me in a little bit. She gave birth to 9 children. And my mother was next to the youngest. There were, let's see if I can remember some of their names, if you want them. William and Lawrence, Nicholas, May, Helen, my mother, Alice, and then there was a younger sister. The youngest in the family was named Ruth, and I'm sure I don't have all the names. But Ruth died fairly young, before she was 20. I have no idea what she died of. It may very well have been the flu that was rampant in that part of the century. Didn't hear too much about Ruth, but just that she had died. And my mother, being the youngest, was sort of bossed around by the rest of the family, especially May and Helen, the older sisters. An interesting thing that my mother revealed to me very late in her life was that her mother and her father, that's Daniel and Nellie, had some kind of long-standing argument or fight or disagreement and did not speak to each other for the majority of their married life. They spoke through the children, Daniel or Helen asked your father to pass the butter, that sort of thing. And my grandmother did not share a bedroom with my grandfather, but slept with the girls in the family. I never did find out what this disagreement was. It must have been something terrible, but that's the way they lived. Now, I never met my grandfather, Daniel. He had died before I was born, probably 2 or 3 years before I was born. And my memory of my grandmother is that she was blind. And this apparently happened a few years after I was born, following an automobile accident in which she was a passenger. But I thought all grandmothers were blind. That was my only grandmother that I knew. And
were they, you may have said this already, Daniel and Nellie, were they born in Ireland?
That's my information, is that they were both born in Ireland. And my grandmother was a great fan of radio soap operas. She couldn't see. There was no TV at the time. And she had a big console radio. And I would go and visit her and stay with her for a week at a time. And we'd sit in a great big armchair together with her little dog Scotty by her feet. And we would listen to Ma Perkins and Our Gal Sunday and some terribly old radio soap operas that probably our children never heard of. But it was great fun. And she got around quite well in her own home with this handicap. She lived with her 2 daughters who never married, May and Helen, both of whom were very bossy, both of whom were working. She was home alone during the day and had a housemaid, Margaret, who was a, quote, girl from Ireland. Margaret had to be in her 60s, but she was the girl. And she took care of Nana, which is what I called my grandmother, and cleaned the house, did the laundry, everything, because my 2 aunts were career women. May worked on Wall Street, and we inherited some of her stocks in General Motors, General Electric, Con Edison, which she had gathered carefully over the years. Not worth tremendous amounts of money, but She was a secretary on Wall Street, and Helen worked. She worked at a college in Queens. It might have been Queens College, in the library. And the story about Helen was that when she was a pretty young thing, she was engaged to be married. She had met a young man whom she loved very much, and he gave her a very pretty ring, had a sapphire in the middle, and was surrounded by diamonds. Not very large, but very pretty. But my grandmother, Nana, did not approve of this young man, and Helen was told to give back the ring, and that was the end of it. And I now have that ring, which I treasure. It's a very pretty ring, but I think the story behind it is very special. So she never married. Neither one of them did. We used to visit them when I was growing up. We'd go over there for Sunday dinner, and which Margaret fixed, the girl fixed, and Aunt May prided herself on being quite the bartender, and she would make Manhattans. That was her favorite drink, and she and my dad would have a couple with the family, and then have a couple out in the kitchen, and would end up having a little bit of a verbal battle before the day was over. And on the way home in the car, my dad would be roundly scolded for treating May that way. You know, that just wasn't right. So, but my earliest, what I was told, was when I was born, which was in Hempstead, New York. I was the youngest of four. Ruth was the oldest, then Mary, then Eddie, and then that was in 3 years, and then 4 years later, I arrived.
Well, I think what I want to do, since you've been talking about your grandparents
Mm-hmm.
and some of their situations, is turn to Bill Ryan, my dad, and ask him some of the same questions about the earlier generations of on his side of the family before we come back to talking about more recent members of the family. But if we could ask the same questions of you about
Sure.
your predecessors.
Sure can. My mother and dad met at the University of California in Berkeley, where they were both going to school in the same year. And my dad had come to California and the school from Salt Lake City, and in particular from a small town near there called Park City, which is now a national and possibly an international ski resort. But at the time my dad left home to go to school in California, and he never actually explained, and I don't think I've asked him, or had asked him, why he chose the University of California. But he was one of five, the second oldest in his family, all boys. His dad, at the time my father left home, was working in the Silver King mine, which was the primary economic engine for the town in which they lived, in Park City. I have visited Park City once, about 20 years ago, I think. And I remember visiting and seeing my father's home. And I'm not sure about the time when I visited, whether I had, and Alice might be able to help me on this, whether I was married at the time or still unmarried.
I think it was before we were married, so it was
So,
a little more than 20 years ago.
well, then it would be a little more than 20 years ago. And I would place it during my trip from Georgetown, having graduated from the college, and before I entered medical school in the fall of the same year, 1953. a friend of mine and I drove in his car to California that summer, and along the way, I made it a point to stop at Park City, Utah. Saw my dad's former home, was still there, and the interesting thing about it was that there was a trap door in the roof of the home. It was built on a hillside, and the purpose of the trap door was to provide a way to get out of the house during the snow season. So it gives you an image of what snow is like in that town, and I guess why it has become a popular ski resort. But my grandfather worked there. Now I'm thinking back about that. My grandfather and my grandmother, when they married, both had the same last name, Ryan. My grandmother's name was Bridget Ryan, so she didn't have to change much about her identity when she married. And my father's name was Patrick. My grandfather's name was Patrick. In addition to working in the Silver King mine, where my father's brothers also began to work, were their first jobs, my grandfather was for a time the sheriff of Park City, Utah. And during those years, and my father filled me in on this story, my dad and my grandfather would make the rounds on a Saturday night of the bars in Park City, keeping the peace. And my dad would go along as sort of a companion. He wasn't big enough to do any peacekeeping, but he collected a lot of souvenirs. He said there were weapons outside these bars that would be left behind after fights, or one of the favorite things they collected were souvenir bottle caps for some reason. I don't know why that sticks in my memory, but it does. And my dad thought it was a great thing to make the rounds with his father and sort of share in the glory of being the sheriff of the town. My dad was actually born, his birthplace was in Oklahoma. The reason for that is that I don't know where my dad's parents were married, but their first home was in what was known or became the Oklahoma Territory, which was open for not here I'm struggling with the years. It was a homesteading opportunity for people from the east to get a piece of land, and I think it was, and Jim may be able to help me with some of this statistical information about the Homesteading Act. If you put a flag down in markers and mark your territory, I think you could lay claim without paying any money to about 160 acres of ground. And in any event, beyond the particulars, this is what my grandparents did, my dad's mother and father.
Were your dad's parents born in the United States, or were they Irish immigrants?
My
Of
dad's
that generation?
parents were born in the United States, to the best of my recollection, in terms of what I remember from my dad's stories. My dad was a fine storyteller. I wasn't always sure if I was getting the facts, but he certainly could weave a story.
And they got better with time.
And
Definitely.
his memory got better over time. Pardon me.
Mhm.
His memory got better, I'm sure. But in any event, I have a picture of my dad's first home in Oklahoma. And my father, during his lifetime, went back and visited the community, the name of which doesn't hit me at the moment, but I do have it, where he was born, out of curiosity. He didn't take any of us with him. But we do have this picture of what was called a sod house. And this really looks primitive. It's a rough wood front with two windows, as I recall a picture, a door, and then sort of a sloping sides back against a hill, and all of the rooftop was dirt, sod. That's what it was made of. And there was grass growing on the top in this photograph. I have another photograph of my dad in knickers and long socks and high shoes and a jacket like we would wear today, with a formal suit, because all of the children in this photograph were dressed, the boys were dressed the same way, of his first year in school. Now I don't know whether that was a kindergarten, first grade, whether he started in second grade. I never got the details from my dad. But it's a very interesting picture of my dad's class and the people in his class at that time. And I think there were about 12 children that are shown in this photograph, 12 or 15 children. And I picked my dad out readily. When I first saw the picture, the question was, well, which is your dad? Well, I picked my dad out. So that's where my dad was born. He was born somewhere in the Oklahoma Territory. And they lived there, my dad's family, for a number of years. I don't know how many, but my guess is that probably 5 years or 6.
Wasn't he born in 1901? That's
My
the
dad
date
was
that I recall.
born in 1901, as was my mother. And after a number of years there, attempting to make a living as a farmer, I'm presuming that's what my grandfather was about. He was never a tradesman or an entrepreneur that I knew about. He went off to find a better job. And he traveled, and for some reason wound up settling in Park City, Utah, a long distance from Oklahoma. But that's where he settled down, and for a couple of years, as I understood it from my dad, my grandfather sent money back to the family for them to live on, and the boys attempted to carry out some elementary farm work on this property that they had homesteaded in Oklahoma. When my grandfather had accumulated enough savings, or they made some further decision, he and my grandmother, Bridget, the family moved to Park City. I don't know how old my dad was when that happened, or how big the family was, how many of the 5 boys were part of that group. So that's where my dad grew. My dad's most vivid recollections were of Park City, where he became somewhat well known as a student. He was a top student in his class in high school, was very active in extracurricular subjects. He played basketball. He got to know the prominent people in the town, and somehow or another my dad decided that his future was not going to be in silver mining, and he was going to get out and do something else.
Do you have much of a recollection or any recollection of your dad's parents? Did you spend much or any time with Bridget or Patrick?
Patrick was deceased when I came along. Bridget, my dad's mother, was not. And thinking of the age when Bridget died, first of all, my mother and dad never left California. So Bridget continued to live in Park City, bringing up the boys for years after her husband died, and I don't remember the cause of death. my hunch is that one of my sisters
Excuse me.
would know some detail about that. Whether it was accidental or in the line of duty as a sheriff or from illness, I don't recall. But Bridget stayed alive, and one of the reasons that this all comes together about my grandmother is that there was a long interval between the fourth and fifth of the boys. My youngest uncle's name was Paul, and the characteristic thing I remember about him was my dad and his brothers all called him Ita Paul. There was such a gap between the fourth and fifth that by that time the four older boys could only envision my Uncle Paul as a baby, and he would just get steamed up because I got to know Paul. When one of the other brothers would come to visit, or there'd be some correspondence or conversation with his mother, and the reference would be made to Ita Paul, meaning little baby Paul. In any event, until Paul reached about the end of high school age, my grandmother, Bridget, stayed in Park City. And then, I'm trying to think of the gap of years. We lived in San Francisco, where I was born, until I was in the 6th grade. And at that time, we moved to Los Angeles. And in that interval, what took place was eventually my dad financed his mother's coming to San Francisco. So the move from Park City would have occurred when I was about in the 5th grade, is my hunch, because I remember visiting my grandmother after she came to San Francisco. I might have been 4th grade. The reason she was then ready to leave Park City is that Ita Paul, my Uncle Paul, had graduated from high school and came to San Francisco, followed my dad, and got a job there, went to school, eventually graduated college, and became an employee of the San Francisco Chamber of Commerce briefly, and then he moved to a job with a city public agency that had to do with shipping, and became a very responsible executive in this governmental bureau. It was, I wish I could recall the name of it, but I might shortly. It doesn't come to me now.
I remember that, I think, as the San Francisco Board of Trade. Is that
The San Francisco
Yay,
Board of
very
Trade.
Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
San Francisco Board of Trade. And by that time, my dad's oldest brother, Harry, had continued to stay in Park City and had become a postal employee in Park City, where he finished his career. And I don't think Harry ever left Park City. And I don't have contact with my cousins from his family. Again, my sisters probably have more detail about that. So Harry was oldest. My dad, Bill William, and I'm not named for him, by the way. I can tell that a little later. Was second. The third of the boys was Frank. And before we left San Francisco, or about when we did, when I was 5 or 6 years old, Frank came to San Francisco, where he married later, and became a postal employee also, which he did for the rest of his career. Retired and subsequently died, but worked for the post office all his career. The third brother, Lawrence, instead of coming to any place out of Park City, joined the military and was a career military officer, I think in what was then the Army Air Force. I've lost track of his career, but I remember my mother being in touch with Larry's wife and corresponding with Larry's wife until, many, many years later. Here again, we never made any cousin contacts much, except with Frank's family. Frank, the postal employee, we got to know, or I got to know his daughter. He had, I think, one daughter and one son. And I followed her career for a while. She became a professional librarian. And I've lost track of her. My dad's last and the fourth brother, and I'm struggling with his name right now, was a bit of a wild guy.
Was that Matthew?
Matthew.
Ryan?
Would be Matthew, yes. Or Matt, he was called. Matt was kind of a wild guy and never went on beyond high school, to my knowledge. He joined the Navy, and I think I have a photograph of Matt on the deck of a submarine in the what World War, I'm not sure, probably the Second World War. I'm not even sure about that. I can't make a connection on dates about Matt, but that's the only recollection I have of Matt. I saw Larry in uniform. I remember that picture mentally, but I don't remember any pictures of Matt. And Matt sort of disappeared from the entire family group. My dad lost track of him. He didn't keep in touch with my grandmother, Bridget. And as far as I know, the family just simply don't know what happened to Matt. My Uncle Paul, when he came to San Francisco, lived with his mother, Bridget. So they came together, and so the combination of my grandmother Bridget and my Uncle Paul, I remember vividly as being together in San Francisco, and we would go to visit my grandmother there. There was always a kind of friction between my dad and Paul, though, and I remember at some point in time my dad writing to his brother Paul, and they were perhaps almost a generation apart. There was a considerable gap in age, and outlining for Paul some advice from my dad about how to handle some business propositions and how to conduct himself in, I guess, in some political venue related to his work. And the memory I have is that Uncle Paul just was incensed about this whole issue of my dad's giving him advice. And so we never really formed a close, ongoing connection with Uncle Paul. My mother kept track of, and Paul eventually did marry, and my mother kept track of and corresponded with his wife. And again, I don't have my mother's correspondence about that. And I defer to the information my two sisters now have, who were the on-scene custodians of my mother's papers and books and personals after her death. On my mother's side, she was an only child, and born very late in her parents' marriage, quite unexpectedly. There was no plan for my mother's arrival. I don't have an estimate about what ages her parents were when she was born, but they had probably been married 10 or 15 years when my mother arrived. The interesting thing about my mother's parents were that they traveled and were part of an entertainment career. My grandfather, my mother's dad, was named Billy, or Bill, or William, and he's the one for whom I am named.
What was his last name?
His last name was Marx, M-A-R-X. And he was part of a vaudeville act that included my grandmother, whose name was, I'm struggling with that, Louise, grandmother Louise, whom I never met. They were both deceased before I was born.
Was her last name Bender? Or my not
Her last
right?
name, her maiden name was Bender. And she was born, my grandmother was born in Sonoma County, California, north of San Francisco. She came from a family that had migrated from around Lancaster area of Pennsylvania, and as far as I know, were what were called Pennsylvania Dutch in that community. And I do have some records of her father's leaving Pennsylvania and going to San Francisco in California to live. Her parents at the time my grandmother married owned and operated a bakery in Sonoma County, California, and were middle-class folks. I don't know Billy Marx's background, where he was born, or anything about his education. To my knowledge, he didn't, if he went to school, it probably wasn't further beyond grammar school. But my strongest recollection of what I was told about him is that he was a very, very gifted man with his hands in carpentry and all sorts of manual arts. And I have some of his tools that were passed down to me by my mother that I cherish and have tried to keep in some working shape. A block plane is one of them that I have, and a small hand plane that are really relics, but in operating condition. And I remember in the home we lived in, San Francisco, on 24th Avenue off of California Street, there was a shop downstairs in the basement, because we lived with my grandparents at the time of my birth. My mother and dad and I and my sister Barbara lived with my grandparents initially in their home. It was a 3-story house on 24th Street, and I have a picture of that house brought back by one of the girls that visited San Francisco,
Maureen.
Maureen.
Mm-hmm.
And we have it framed, and it looks just like it looked when I lived there.
Was your grandfather living when you were born?
My granddad had just died.
But your
when I was
grandmother
born.
was still living? in
My
the
grandmother was still living in the house,
Mm.
and I have no clear recollection except of her being an invalid in bed. And I can remember visiting her bedroom periodically, but I don't have any sense of her as a person myself. And she died shortly after I was born, and I don't know at this point how many years that was. My sister Bobby would know better than I might. So at that point, we stayed in that house, and it was one of the two places we lived in San Francisco before our family moved to Los Angeles. And we were in touch with my Uncle Paul there and my grandmother Bridget. So we had a sort of a small family group in San Francisco, while my dad initially was on the faculty at the University of San Francisco. He had graduated in accounting from Berkeley, California, and gotten a job on the faculty, starting, of all things, an accounting department, which the University of San Francisco at the time didn't have. So my dad came into the school without a graduate degree and started up the Department of Accounting, University of San Francisco. And my mother continued or got a job as a teacher, which she continued all her career in all of the places we lived. My mother taught full or part-time over all the years. In fact, until not too long before she died, when she died, she was living in Chicago, well, had been living in Chicago. More detail about that later. I think that kind of pulls together most of it, but about my grandparents, just a couple of other interesting anecdote things. As an only and surprising arrival in their life with my grandparents, my mother was a very favored child and was given all of the best that could be had for children at the time. But she didn't see a whole lot of her dad, in that after she was born, and I don't recall where she was born, but my recollection is it might have been while they were on a tour, a vaudeville tour, her parents, in Mexico. And I remember hearing my mother telling me one time, is because of this traveling and all, the first language she spoke was Spanish. And they had a very successful tour in Mexico, and I can't say how long they stayed down there. It wasn't just a short trip. But shortly after my mother was born, within about 2 years or so, my grandmother stopped traveling with the group, and my grandfather continued with them because he was the mechanic who put together the magic parts and props and boxes and tricks, because they were a magic show. And the operator of the show was my grandmother's brother-in-law, whose name was Zamlock. His name was Archie Zamlock. And I can remember meeting Archie Zamlock years later, before he died, and being very impressed with his legerdemain, and he could slip coins out of his sleeve and things would appear in his hand, and he would do tricks for me like that, and I was really intrigued with all of this man's background. But the interesting part about that too was, because of my grandfather's affection for my mother, he sent weekly postcards, or even twice weekly postcards, back to her, and she kept all of these postcards. And he called her Petty. My mother's nickname was Petty, and it would be addressed to Petty. And I've seen many of these cards. They're in the possession of, I think, my sister Mary right now, this collection. But it was almost a shoebox full of postcards that were fascinating, because I think they'd be collector's items today. They had all sorts of very attractive fronts on these postcards, very complex and interesting pictures from places where my grandfather stopped when the troupe that he worked with would travel from one city to another. And they come from, a wide range of places in the western states, and not just in Mexico, but many, many other spots, and could almost track my grandfather's career by checking the dates and the return post stamps on these postcards. It's a fascinating collection. I think that pretty much gives a picture of my grandparents. I recall my grandmother's death only vaguely. We were at the time in St. Monica's Parish in San Francisco, and my mother was teaching at the junior high school English, which she taught the rest of her career. And my dad had left the University of San Francisco for a better paying job with the San Francisco Advertising Agency, name of which Foster and Kleiser, and went into the accounting department with Foster and Kleiser. And at that time, billboards were a very important advertising medium. Radio was sort of on the scene and growing. There was an NBC affiliate in San Francisco called KGO, which broadcast the NBC shows for the city of San Francisco. And after a number of years, and before we left San Francisco, so I would have been probably about 10 years old or 11, my dad became the manager of the KGO radio station outlet for NBC in San Francisco.
Now, approximately, what year would that have been?
Let me think. I have to attach this to times when I remember leaving the city. I said 6th grade.
It would have been about 11.
So I would have been about 11, so it would have been about 1941.
All right. Well, in 1941, Mom Alice would have been about a first grader. And
Just
I
about.
wanted to turn
Just
the
about.
turn the narrative back to Mom's side of the family and have
Okay.
and have her talk about her recollections, I guess, of your parents' activities and personalities and adventures as much as you can remember them, and maybe after talking about that, mention something about your immediate family, brothers and sisters, and their adventures.
Well, as I said before, my dad lied about his age and joined the Navy. He did serve some time in the service. He was on a ship, I forget what kind, but I still have pictures of him in his Gob's cap and his tight navy blouse, which was a family treasure. I have no idea what happened to it. I don't know how he became a salesman. He left the service after his allotted time, and as far back as I can remember, he was a traveling salesman, and he dealt in Quaker lace tablecloths. That was a favorite. Lace curtains.
Where was he living after he got out of the service and began to get involved with being a salesperson?
Well, both of my parents were born in Brooklyn on Long Island, and he was working in New York City. In fact, that's where he was. Well, he was raised in Queens, which is outside of New York City on Long Island. But when he went to work as a salesman, it was in New York City. He worked for several different companies. He always called them firms. I don't know the connection there. But he did a lot of traveling. And that's all I remember my dad ever doing. I don't know if he had other jobs before he did that. My mother, as I said, was essentially the youngest in her family after her sister Ruth died. She went to normal school, which was about an 18-month, 2-year program to qualify a person as a teacher. And She also played the piano beautifully. She often would wistfully say she would like to have been a pianist, but her sisters told her that was not a very economically sound thing to do. You couldn't make a living at that. So she obligingly went to normal school, and she taught elementary classes. She taught the Montessori method, which was the way to teach at the time. It's sort of the in thing to do now, sort of enjoying a revival at this time. But at the time, that was the way teachers were instructed to teach their students. My own memory of my mother is not as a teacher. She eventually became a secretary, went to secretarial school, became a very efficient secretary. They lived initially in Brooklyn. In fact, my sister Ruth was born in Brooklyn, and my sister Mary, the second child, was born there about a year later, and my brother Ed was also born in Brooklyn.
Do you remember any of the streets or addresses back in Brooklyn?
I don't remember the streets, but they lived in a section called Flatbush, which we've all heard of Flatbush Avenue. I don't know exactly where in Flatbush they lived. My grandmother, Nana, who was blind, lived in an area called Kew Gardens, which was in Queens. It was not in Brooklyn, and but there was a lot of visiting back and forth. Eventually, my parents moved from Brooklyn to a town called West Hempstead, which was on Long Island in Nassau County. And this was just a little farther out than Brooklyn and Queens. It was the suburbia. The Long Island Railroad went right through Nassau County, right through West Hempstead. And we lived in West Hempstead, and that is where I was born. I was born in Mercy Hospital in West Hempstead. I was told that I was a very small baby, about 5 pounds, and that I had a mysterious condition which was first considered to be rickets, which is a vitamin C deficiency?
Deficiency, yes. C?
Then
No.
A, vitamin A.
Yes. Excuse me.
Anyway, this was what they suspected I had. I was very sickly, and I had a lot of trouble breathing. There seemed to be some obstruction. Then they decided that no, I had an enlarged thymus gland, which resides close to the thyroid gland. And I received radiation for this. Now, this was back in 1935. I'm not sure what the radiation was like back at that time. However, I think in retrospect, I often wondered if I did not have the same condition that you, Jim, have, or had as a baby, which was an enlargement or a stricture of the larynx, which caused breathing to be very difficult. Because the description I have of myself as a baby sort of matches what you had as a baby. Well, we'll never know. We'll never know. But I was 4 years younger than my brother Ed. I was the baby of the family, always called Little Alice to distinguish me from my mother, who was Big Alice. And my brother was Little Ed, Little Eddie, to distinguish him from my dad, who was Edward, Ed. We lived in West Hempstead for, I think, until I was probably 4 years old.
Do you remember the street name?
Stratford Avenue in West Hempstead. Why I remember that, I'll never know. Stratford Avenue. And it was a white stucco house with brown trim, big pointy front entrance. Very nice neighborhood. We had good friends there that remained friends for decades after that. The Herrings, they lived up the street. We moved 3 times that I remember as I was going through grade school and high school. I think my dad struggled a bit to make a living, and my mother went back to work when I was quite small. And we, in turn, just like my grandmother, had an Irish girl who worked with us, lived with us. Iris was her name, and Iris was in charge of me because I was the only one at home all day. We became great buddies. But I remember distinctly the little room she had in our house. It was always very neat and tidy, and I remember her taking care of me when I had measles or mumps, something like that. But she was a member of the family. She did the cooking and the washing. And my mother at the time had returned to work several months after she had me and worked as a secretary at St. Albans High School in St. Albans, which was in Queens. It was a big city high school, big public high school. And she was first the payroll clerk before adding machines. She did it all by hand, and for the rest of her life could total up a column of figures faster than you could do it on an adding machine.
Yeah.
Great shorthand technician. She never used a dictaphone. She took shorthand dictation. And she ended up being the secretary to the principal of this high school. I think she worked for 2 principals, as a matter of fact. And she worked for the rest of her career. And my dad also worked. He worked in New York. That was where his office was. But again, he traveled extensively. So he'd be away for 3-4 weeks at a time. Sometimes would take my older sisters on a trip with him. Might go for 3 or 4 days to Boston, or 2 or 3 days to Chicago. He drove all the time. He drove a Packard. That was his favorite car. Big car, big heavy car. And this was before there were very good highways. There was the Pennsylvania Turnpike, but that was about it. And he did a great deal of driving, but he loved it. He really enjoyed it. I remember being the baby of the family forever and ever.
Would he ever? What sorts of selling did he do? What did he sell? And how did that all play out?
Just to interrupt, I knew him as a furniture and carpet salesman.
No, I don't think he ever sold carpet.
But
he sold
Quaker
Lace.
furniture.
Quaker Lace was a company that made curtains, not draperies, but curtains, lace tablecloths. He, I know at one time, was selling drapery fabric and upholstery fabric. That was the main thing that I remember him doing, the upholstery fabric. And what he would do, he had these huge sample cases. They were black leather. You'd lay it out flat on the floor, pile the samples on. The samples were about, half the size of a card table, and get a stack about 1.5 feet high, and then pull up the flaps, buckle it shut. And he would carry 3 or 4 of these with him in the car. And when he'd get to Boston, or he did a lot of business in North Carolina where the furniture factories were. When he'd get to his destination, he would get a hotel room that had what he called a showroom. It was actually a sitting room. He would spread out his samples and then invite representatives from these furniture companies to come in and look at the samples and pick out their choices. He didn't actually sell furniture, but he sold the fabric to the manufacturers. Sometimes he had to carry the sample cases to the factories, which was very inconvenient and very hard. But he enjoyed meeting people. He enjoyed the clubbiness of it, and I'm sure did a little drinking on the road with his company buddies. But I think he worked very hard at what he did. He played a little golf when he was at home, but it was always a business deal. He would take somebody out to play a round of golf, and there was always the end point of wanting to do business with them.
What was his handicap? Do you remember?
I have no idea. He was never a very good golfer.
I think that's passed down through the generations.
Well, you never know.